Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning into today's Rome Historical Virtual Program. My name is Miranda. I'm the educator here at Rome Historical Society. And today we're joined by author, puppeteer, and storyteller, Melanie Zimmer. So hello, Melanie. How are you doing?
Hello.
Good.
Fine. It's great to be here today.
We're happy to have you here. We're very excited. I wanted to let everyone know Rome Historical Society offers free monthly programming on the third Wednesday of every month, which is now switched to our virtual format to ensure everyone's safety during this health crisis. So we encourage you to leave comments on this video, give us feedback, and tell us your thoughts on today's program. The Historical Society is still closed to the public, but we're looking forward to opening next soon. You can find the most up-to-date information on our reopening plan on our website, romehistoricalsociety.org, or on our Facebook page, facebook.com/romehistorical. You can also donate through the website and our Facebook page to support more programming like this in the future. So today, like I said, we have Melanie here with us, and she's the author of Curiosities of Central New York, a book filled with little-known tales of Central New York region. So today, she's going to tell us some local tales and legends from in and around Rome, New York. So we're excited for that. And the Historical Society has found a bit of evidence to connect to some of the stories that Melanie's going to share with us today. So that's very exciting. So Melanie, if you'd like to take a moment to introduce yourself and we can get into the content.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today. And yeah, so I'm going to be telling stories from actually two of my books. One of them is Curiosities of Central New York. That looks backwards to me. I hope it isn't.
Looks good to me.
Oh, good. And Myths, Legend, and Lore, Central New York and the Finger Lakes. One of them will be from here. So I actually wrote 4 books for the History Press, and over a few years' time, most of which was centered in the Central New York area. And the first book I actually wrote for them was this. And the way that happened is I was working as a puppeteer and a storyteller, and I was itinerant. I was going to different places, and wherever I went, people would tell me a bit about their place, you know, stories that had happened there, stories that were very interesting, but maybe weren't known broadly, you know, just in that area. So I would write those down just for my own benefit. And so when the History Press actually asked me to write a book on myths, legend, and lore of the area, I actually did have some material on which I could begin. Right. I wasn't quite sure it was enough, you know, because I actually hadn't written a full book at that point yet in my life. So I also made contact with someone I knew, is Dr. Daniel Ward, who was the regional folklorist at the time, and he put me in touch with some people. He gave me names and numbers and told me maybe, you know, they can tell you this story or they can tell you that story, you know, about the area. So I was able to gain some more stories in that way. And of course, you know, as always, I relied on some written documentation as well. So, you know, so the sources I have, you know, for this first book were very much, you know, varied. The second book I wrote was actually this. If you find it today, it doesn't actually look like this. I actually requested they change the cover because I thought maybe it looked like a juvenile book, and it's not. It's an adult book. And I tended to rely more on written material for that because at the time I had broken my elbow and I was recovering and I couldn't, you know, even hold a phone and write at the same time. So I just, you know, my types of sources did change, you know, for that. The third book I wrote, which you're going to be hearing a lot about today, well, because I was telling 3 of the 4 stories from this book, is Central New York and the Finger Lakes. During the time between this book and this book, I had accumulated more stories or had heard about stories. And so I wanted to continue on that same theme. And I wanted to be more, again, myth, legend, lore, you know, folktale kind of things from the region. Because as a storyteller, it was particularly what I was interested in. But, you know, I was also interested in history. I think a little bit of that creeped into. And but they wanted to change the name from myth, legend, and lore, and not just to make sure people understood this was entirely new material, so it became Curiosities. And then, the fourth book was Curiosities of the Finger Lakes, which is obviously not really this region. So I won't be talking about that at all today. But today what I will be talking about, are 4 different stories. The Historical Society asked me to follow 2 parameters. One, that it be very local, and there are some things that are really local. And the second thing, this is October, so they'd really like a Halloween theme. So with this kind of material, there's ample. All right. So for our first story, we're going to be talking about the giant mosquito of the Oneidas, and it's also known as the roteo. This story I heard from a park ranger at Fort Stanwix, and her name was Susan Jones. And Susan Jones was of Native American heritage, but she was not Haudenosaunee heritage, I believe. But she told me this story that was said to take place right on the grounds, basically, where the fort stands today. She told me that, in fact, long ago, well, the fort itself is built on a glacial formation. And long ago, there was a glacier there. As the water melted, the land became damp and marshy. And in that area lived a huge monster. It was a giant mosquito. It was absolutely immense, and it was the meanest creature. Its stinger was perhaps this long. I know you can't see my hands, but it was very long, like almost like a sword. So this was a terrible creature that everyone feared, including the bravest warriors, because basically, if it stung you, it could ram you right through and suck you dry and leave you for dead. It was pretty horrible. So people avoided the swamp areas until one day a young Oneida brave decided he was going to end this mess. And he went to the swamp areas where he knew he would find this giant mosquito, armed only with his bow and arrow. And so he went out there and he found the mosquito, and he took careful aim, and he released the arrow, and off it flew right into the heart of the mosquito. And it killed it dead, and the mosquito fell down there into the swampy areas. And you think everything would be over and things would be perfect, but no. Instead, from the corpse of the mosquito arose hundreds and thousands of little tiny mosquitoes, the same very mosquitoes that plague us even today when it gets wet around here. So that's the story. The Ranger Jones explained that the story it's a teaching story. It tells a couple of things that are important, and one of those things is that sometimes it's important to be brave and take up arms to defend your family or your people. And another important lesson that could be learned from this is that sometimes even the bravest warriors are tested. So that's the story. And I believe we have an image of the Striker House. Before the fort is obviously a reconstruction. Fort wouldn't have lasted that long, but before that was the Striker House, which we have an image of here. I think it's very interesting once it comes up. Yes. There it is. And yeah, so we have some images that show also 4 cannons that marked the bastions of where the Fort Stanwix construction was before this house was built. And I imagine that they used these really as markers when they did the reconstruction. Do you think so, Miranda?
Yeah, they were markers. They did do an archaeological excavation of the site to make sure, but before the reconstruction, these cannons were in place to mark where the fort was. So you can see right here that the Striker House is on the location, part of the location of where the fort stands today.
Wonderful. Yeah. So, shall I go ahead and tell my next story?
Yeah, what's your next story that you have?
My next story is actually from an entire different period of time. It's from the period of the canals. And the Erie Canal was started in Rome. You know, they started in Rome and decided to dig in both directions. You know, so even though there were detractors of the canal, people could see immediately there was a good progress and this was going to really happen. And a lot of people came to dig the canal. A lot of those people were Irish people that came. And it was very hard work, very dangerous work. not just because of the digging, but because of disease. You know, a lot of people did die of disease during the digging of the canal. And, you know, many of these people who came were Irish people. And as the canal developed and these people were there, stories developed about the canal. And in one of the cycles of stories is the cycles of Red McCarthy. Now, Red McCarthy isn't a real man. He's essentially the same kind of character as Pecos Bill or Paul Bunyan or, you know, any of those really, you know, legendary characters. These are tall tales that were told on the canal. But the character of Red McCarthy actually mirrors what was important to those people who lived and worked on the canal. He was a man who liked to enjoy himself, yet he was really hardworking. He was smart, and he was very strong, and he liked to have fun. All of those things really, I think, embodied the spirit of the people who lived and worked on the canal. And so we have a whole cycle of tall tales, you know, revolving around Red McCarthy. But I know you think I'm going to tell you a Red McCarthy story, but I'm really not. I'm going to tell you about his frog. You just need to know who he is. So one day, Red McCarthy was walking along South James Street, and he saw a pollywog there, and he decided to keep it as a pet. So he named it Joshua, and he took care of Joshua, and Joshua grew and grew as pollywogs do. He turned into a frog, grew legs, and hopped away, and he wasn't seen for some time. But then, quite some time later, Red McCarthy was up near Impeyville Pond, and he saw Joshua again, and my, how Joshua had grown. He was huge. His back legs were 6 feet long. His front legs were 3 feet long. And oh my gosh, his body was enormous. When he popped into the pond there, the spout went 30 feet high. Well, he was feeding on all kinds of creatures, you know, some of the bugs that we have in the area, mosquitoes, flies, squirrels, chipmunks, rabbits, whatever. You know, he had quite an appetite. But just like Red McCarthy, he had, you know, a real helpful side to him. He was always ready to lend a hand. And so it wasn't long before the frog got a job as an assistant at the sawmill for the city. And he started working there. He was really a great worker. He was so strong, just like Red McCarthy was. You know, if they had a load of logs that was too heavy for the horses to pull, they just hitched it up to the frog, you know, and Joshua would take a giant leap forward, and sure enough, you know, those logs would be moved. But mostly he was known for his public works. Back then, the roads were pretty terrible. They often zigzagged. Nothing was straight. It was as if they made the roads following an old deer path or something, and it just was very difficult to drive on. So what they would do is they put a hook on the end of the road, and then they'd put Joshua in a giant harness, and they'd hook the hook up to Joshua's back, and he'd take a giant leap forward, and that road would be lengthened and straightened out just like that. And that's why we have so many fantastic roads here around the rural America. Now, it wasn't the only thing he was known for. He actually moved the town barn 33.5 feet. In the same way, they just hooked him up and boom, you know, there he moved it. And so, you know, he was always doing things that were very helpful. So I have here a little bit that was actually published in the Rome Sentinel in 1934. The last sighting of the Impeyville frog was in 1934. So we lived a good long time. This was by Floyd Esch. And it was in the summer of 1934 that he sighted him. I had been north of Impeyville, building a picnic table for a Roman man at his camp. And this Roman will vouch for the following event. As we were returning home late one evening and arrived at the busy corner in Impeyville, old Joshua sat under a tree catching his lunch. Some of the giant monstrous insects that inhabit the region. We waited for nearly half an hour until he'd gotten his fill. While we were waiting, the pond filled with water. As Joshua turned to enter the pond overflowed, and the road and washed the road out. So we had to rebuild it before we could proceed home. So that's the last known sighting of him in 1934. But he actually had 4 grandsons who also grew big and strong, but none of them approached the size or the musculature that, in fact, Joshua had. And they also were said to have worked at the very same, for the city is also, they were pulling stumps. So that's my story of Joshua the Frog. And I really like those Red McCarthy stories. They're awfully fun.
I think it's funny to think about a frog working at a sawmill, it's something a little ridiculous, but we actually found, as I was looking through the old Rome Sentinel articles, some articles that mention the Empyville frog, and these go up into the 1970s. The story stuck around, which was cool.
That's nice. I would have loved to have met him.
Yeah, me too.
What a frog.
Okay.
So the next story I'm going to tell you is the story of stone giants. So I guess I wanted to mention a little bit about background material, for Haudenosaunee stories. There's some interesting things that I ended up having to consider. One of the interesting things about the Haudenosaunee, otherwise known as the Iroquois, is, they didn't actually have a written language until recently. So traditionally, the stories were passed down, from person to person over years. And, I'm sure all stories change with time, but nonetheless, I think essentially a lot of the stories might, still retain a lot of their initial character. But something happened in 1870 that changed this, unfortunately. So there was a policy with the U.S. government that they were going to assimilate the Indians, and that involved boarding schools. And so they would take the children away and send them to boarding schools. But one of the goals was to have them basically become more, I guess, American, speak English rather than a native language, not be telling the stories that they were telling, not being, involved in the traditions that they were involved in. So there tends to be a gap, early stories from, say, the Haudenosaunee would have been recorded in a language other than that, because there was no written, language early on. So if you're lucky enough to get a really early story, it would be maybe in English, perhaps, by someone who was here who perhaps spoke both or understood. So it might not have been written by the people themselves. And then, between 1870 and like 1928, I think there's a lot of things that would be transferred, stories have been transferred person to person, stopped being transferred because, the kids were, at boarding school, they weren't listening to grandma at home and hearing these stories. So one interesting thing happened in 1904. A man named Arthur C. Parker, you probably know her. Parker was born at the Cattaraugus Reservation. He was actually Seneca Indian. He was not Oneida or Onondaga. He's not exactly from here, but he was, one of the tribes. And he became an ethnologist for the New York State Museum. And one of his goals was recording these old traditions, these old stories, and so on. So, when I was doing research for some Native American things, I did actually draw on Parker. When I was doing research for, I think in the first book, I reached out to the Oneida Indian Nation, to see, if I could really connect with some storytellers there who might be, transmitting stories. And they put me in touch with 2 people, and they were very nice. And one one of the people, I mean, she was learning all her stories from books. So I think it was an interest in, you know, getting back to those original stories. And sometimes, you know, sometimes things didn't continue to be transmitted. And it's kind of sad, you know, because I know there were stories that were saved by people like Parker or others, but there are also probably many things that were lost, you know, during that period of time. So I just kind of wanted to mention, you know, as you look back, that these kinds of things, you know, might be going on. So I wanted to tell you some stories of the stone giants. And there are a lot of stories of stone giants, actually, but to understand them, I want to tell you the beginning story, which didn't actually happen here, but so you know what they are. And I'll tell you the demise of the stone giants. So, you know, just know that there are stories in between that, you know, could be told or heard or learned. So once there was a family and they were wandering over by the Mississippi River, and they wanted to cross. They were on the east side and they wanted to cross over to the west side. And so they found a vine. And slowly, I don't know how they did this, you know, whether they were swinging across or they were pulling themselves across, but somehow, one by one, they were crossing the Mississippi River using this vine. And most of the people got across, but then the vine broke. And so some of the people were left on this side of the Mississippi River, and they couldn't connect with their family. They just were here, and the rest of the people went away. There was just no way they could cross. So they started to wonder, and they began to lose, you know, the sense of who they were, you know, who their people were. They kind of lost, you know, their language and their culture and things like that. And they became strange, you know, they weren't the same. They began to cannibalize people. And they also adopted a strange habit, which was wetting themselves and then rolling in the sand. And then they would let the sand stick all over their body. And this sand made them impermeable to arrows. So they became known as stone giants. So this is how stone giants began. Some of the stories tell them as like being big, enormous people. And, you know, I don't know how, maybe they were. But so the end of the stone giants is kind of interesting. The stone giants harassed people. As I say, they were kind of awful, and they would come after people, and, you know, they might eat you, kill you, whatever. And no matter what you did, you could shoot at them all day, and it didn't matter because they were stone giants. They had this horrible hard skin that made them basically immune to anything that you'd shoot at them. So the stone giants were, you know, they harassed the Tuscaroras and the, you know, others, and they were heading up toward the fort at Onondaga. And the holder of heaven said, you know, this is enough. I have to do something. I finally have to step in against these people. So he disguised himself as a stone giant, and he got a big war club, and he became the leader of the stone giants. And so he went up there with them, and he said, well, why don't you rest here at the base of this cliff? Because the typical time for attack was first thing in the morning. And they did. And then he sneaked up on the cliffside and sent down a ton of rocks that just buried the stone giants forever. And that was the demise of the stone giants. So that demise, you know, that story of the stone giants, but it made an impression on people. And during the time when the Cardiff Giants hoax was, you know, coming into being, when they found this is really a carved giant man, you put pores in him to make it look realistic, although I'm not quite sure how realistic it looks. People wondered, well, you know, this story could be true because look, we found buried in the same area a stone giant. And that stone giant is actually found over at Cooperstown in the museum today, that you can actually view that stone giant. So I think you have a picture, don't you?
Yeah, we have a picture of it. So my understanding of the Cardiff Giant is it was kind of like a tourist attraction. They would carve them and bury them and then say, look what we found here. You should come see it. Is that, and you know, it's interesting.
Well, the stone giant is kind of a weird story. I don't know how much I want to get into. This is, yeah. So the person who did this hoax was offended, I guess, by, I forget now, his sister or somebody had brought some sort of man who was very religious, and he believed in all these things that he didn't, and so he decided he was going to get back at him. He was going to create this hoax, and so it was actually a revenge hoax. But yeah, they made a lot of money on it, and Barnum went for it too. He tried to purchase this.
Wow.
And they wouldn't let him do it, so he made his own stone giant, and he actually went to court. Because they sued him. They said, you can't have that stone giant because this was the real, the real Cardiff giant. And actually Barnum won the lawsuit because he said, how can you charge me with being the hoax of a hoax?
Right. Well, it makes for an interesting story,
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's a really fascinating. I mean, if you get into it. So yeah. So it's worth taking the trip down to Cooperstown to have a look at the real thing too. It looks quite small here, but it's impressive. It's impressive. I don't think I would think it's a real person. I mean, flesh usually does not petrify like that, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, he became quite the attraction at the time. There were people could come up on canal boats and easily get to Cardiff, and it became a really big deal. I think it spent some time in New York City too, drinking people.
Wow. Yeah, very cool. Well, thank you, Melanie. That was your last story, so thank you very much for sharing those with us.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to tell stories of the local area. I enjoyed it a great deal.
And it's fun to hear them too, especially in October when there's mysticism in the air. So that's nice. Thank you for captivating us with all those stories. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today. Don't forget to give us feedback, leaving comments, liking, and sharing this video. And we hope to see you at our next program in November.
Thank you so much.